To learn more about earning college credits with study hall courses, go to gostudyhall.com or click the link in the description. In 1888, 24-year-old Ushijima Kinji was one of over 400,000 Japanese citizens who immigrated to the United States between 1886 and 1911. Like many Japanese immigrants, Kinji settled in sunny California and set to work building a new life for himself. Now, as a way to assimilate or adopt the identity and culture as a way to fit in, Kinji changed his name to George Shima. He used his savings then to buy cheap, swampy, mosquito-ridden land, and soon, he was known by yet another name, the Potato King. By 1909, that land Shima purchased had become a certifiable spud empire, and Shima was now a potato baron. His farm produced more potatoes than any other in the entire world, and Shima became the first Japanese-American millionaire in the United States. People came to the United States from all over the world in search of that same kind of success, but it wasn't always so easy. Shima had a leg up over many immigrants, arriving with a hefty $1,000 in his pocket, which is the equivalent to over $30,000 in 2023. Immigrants like George Shima also faced rampant xenophobia both from their neighbors and from the US government itself. A series of laws passed in California, like the Alien Land Laws of 1913 and 1920, restricted the rights of Japanese, Chinese, Korean, and Indian immigrants to buy and own farmland. These laws forced Shima to transfer his assets to another company so that he wouldn't lose everything he'd worked so hard for. Despite these challenges, immigration exploded in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. While we'll be focusing on Japanese immigration in this episode, people from places like Germany, Ireland, and China also flooded into the United States in search of a better life, escaping things like famine or religious persecution. In the 20th century, these immigrants became a key resource that helped powers like the US grow. But for the migrants themselves, the immigration process wasn't always straightforward. Hi, I'm Rob Fuller, and this is Study Hall, Modern World History. So, during the 20th century, lots of people were leaving their home countries for other places for a whole gaggle of reasons. Some to pursue better opportunities, like George Shima, others to get away from war and conflict, and still some left because they just didn't have access to important things like food, shelter, or employment. Thanks to the Industrial Revolution and improvements in agriculture, sanitation, and medicine, more people had a better chance of living a longer life starting in the mid-1800s. New agricultural technology led to higher crop yields and more accessible food in industrialized countries. Combined with healthcare advancements, mortality rates dropped and lifespans increased. That meant more children now lived to adulthood, so they had more kids, which led to a baby boom. Since Europe led the world in industrialization, the population boom started there. During the 19th century, the European population doubled, topping out at around 400 million people. The situation in East Asia was similar. China's population reached at least 450 million by the mid-1800s, which was 3 times its population in 1500. Even Japan, which industrialized around 50 years after Europe, still grew to around 34 million people during this period, putting it neck and neck with other nations like France and Austria-Hungary. These were some of the biggest population explosions the world had ever seen, and they happened so fast that even with the help of all this new tech, there just weren't jobs, food, and shelter for everyone. At this point, countries had 2 choices. They could figure out a way to support their quickly growing populations, which could get expensive fast, or they could make these folks someone else's problem. Kind of like how today Rob often leaves the dirty dishes for tomorrow Rob. The second option was easier and cheaper, so many countries began promoting emigration, where people leave one country to settle elsewhere. Emigration isn't quite the same thing as immigration, which is when people enter a new country. English, am I right? Despite tricky terms, the fact is that during the 20th century, people were moving in and out of countries all over the world in search of work, better living conditions, and a shot at prosperity. Advances in transit also helped to boost migration. Thanks to new roads, railways, steamships, and canals, people in countries like England, China, and Japan could move around more quickly and easily than ever before. Empires started seeing this migration trend as an opportunity. If they played their cards right and funded the right ventures, they could use migration to get rid of all those pesky people with the nerve to need things like food and water, while simultaneously expanding their own global footprint. For instance, Japanese immigrants weren't just flowing into the United States. Many were encouraged by their own government to settle elsewhere in Asia as an important tool for empire building. After the Tokugawa shogunate fell to civil war, the Meiji Restoration started in 1868 as a movement to grow Japan's population. The Meiji government had watched other empires' economic booms and wanted to strengthen Japan, growing it to a true global power. They believed population growth was the sign of a strong nation, so Japan intentionally created a population boom. The government provided new support to ensure healthy births, like required medical training for midwives, making it less risky to have children. They also included other governmental controls over reproduction, such as the formal outlawing of abortion and infanticide. But despite Japan's rapid industrialization, it was tough to provide enough food, jobs, land, and housing for their booming population, just like what was happening over in Europe and China. But the government had a plan for that. Japan wanted to grow their economy, so they followed Europe's example and, you guessed it, started creating colonies. Japan took a page out of the Anglo-American colonization playbook and began implementing a process of settler colonialism. In addition to good old-fashioned military force, the government sent lots of Japanese immigrants to displace native populations and eventually seize political control over their land. And in the 19th century, Japan set its settler colonial sights on one neighbor in particular: Korea. In 1876, Japan opened up trade with the previously isolated Korea through the Treaty of Gonghwa. Then, starting in the 1880s, Japan's poorest citizens began settling in Korea. Japan decided to capitalize on this movement, passing laws that encouraged small and mid-sized merchants to head to Korea too. The government financed this emigration and even removed passport requirements to make it easier for Japanese settlers to leave Japan. This process of settler colonialism was, of course, scaffolded by the wars Japan waged on their neighbors, such as the Sino-Japanese War in 1894. This conflict culminated in the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895, which officially recognized Japanese dominance in Korea. This process of the colonization of Korea was really successful. By 1910, 150,000 Japanese immigrants lived in Korea. So Japan decided to rinse and repeat this immigration colonization process elsewhere in Asia. In 1905, Japan gained control of Manchuria's Kwangtung-leased territories from Russia. To protect their new land, Japan assigned a governor general to establish consulates and special forces throughout the area. Then, in 1906, the South Manchuria Railway Company, or SMRC, was established to oversee commercial and industrial development. With the support of the Kwangtung Army, the SMRC managed everything from coal mines to hotels to hospitals to public utilities. Basically, the SMRC was really the SMRCCMHHPU, but that acronym just didn't catch on for some reason. Then, in the 1930s, Japan approved a plan to relocate 5 million Japanese people and establish Manchuria as a puppet state, which is when a state looks independent on paper, but is actually under the control of another country. And by 1940, Japan managed to evict thousands of Chinese, Korean, and Manchu farmers to make space for around 1 million Japanese settlers. While some immigration was specifically encouraged by governments, many other people chose immigration as a reaction to what was going on at home. Now, people didn't have to sit around and take whatever mistreatment their government flung at them. They had somewhat more control over their own lives and destinies. And while the United States wasn't the only nation that could offer immigrants a better life, the American dream was mighty powerful marketing. Back in Japan, where the immigration trend was in full swing, many heard stories about the booming economy of the United States. But Japanese immigrants faced an uphill journey. Once they got to the US, they faced the same discrimination and prejudice that George Shima did. While immigration strengthened the economy of the United States, the xenophobic government and media stoked panic among white Americans, using racial propaganda to pit US laborers against their immigrant neighbors. Some Americans falsely believed immigrants would bring down wages and buy up all of the good farmland. As tensions over immigration escalated, the Meiji state and the US government came to an understanding known as the Gentleman's Agreement. The Japanese government would stop issuing passports to the US for most citizens, and in exchange, the federal government would put pressure on California to remove policies that discriminated against Japanese immigrants already living in the state. One of the few exceptions to this passport policy was for the wives of Japanese men who already lived in the US. This restricted immigration period became known as the Yobiyoshi Jidai, where only relatives of current immigrants were allowed to immigrate. This actually created a pretty big loophole for single Japanese men in the US. First, single men wrote to relatives back home and asked for help with finding a wife. Then their families contacted a suitable woman, provided a picture of the potential groom, and proposed on his behalf. The woman, or more specifically the woman's family, would basically have to swipe right and agree to an arranged marriage without ever speaking to the future groom. These women became known as picture brides because they'd only met their husbands through photographs. Romantic? Not really. Effective? You know it. Once she committed, she would hop on a ship and make the long journey to the United States, where she would finally meet her husband and settle down in places like San Francisco's Japantown. When meeting their husbands on the docks, many women were shocked to find that the pictures they'd been given weren't exactly accurate. Their fiancés were often much older and less attractive than their pictures suggested. That's right, catfishing was a thing even in the early 20th century. For many of the thousands of picture brides that came to America between 1908 and 1920, this was the first of many disappointments. Instead of the prosperous life they were promised, picture brides worked long hours as farm laborers or servants for white US women. Japanese immigrants like picture brides left behind everything they knew and loved, including their families and cultural traditions. And of course, this was true for so many immigrants throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, like the Germans escaping governmental persecution following the failed revolution of 1848, and the Irish escaping the Great Famine in the 1840s and 50s. And unfortunately, these immigrants, including Japanese folks, found themselves at the receiving end of intense prejudice from not only their neighbors, but the government itself. Asian immigrants were segregated from other children in public schools and targeted by laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited Chinese citizens from migrating to America altogether. There were laws against racial intermarrying, and the Immigration Act of 1924, which limited the number of people who could immigrate to the US by nationality. And of course, we have the Alien Land Laws, the one that prevented Asian immigrants like George Shima from owning land, all of which meant that for many, the dream of a better life never did become a reality. By the end of the 19th century, the world was more connected than ever, thanks to new industries and networks for travel and exchange, giving both countries and individuals more power over where people moved and lived. While some migration led to new opportunities and agency for people around the world, some state-sponsored initiatives were more empire-focused, giving governments new ways to build up their colonies and grow their economies, often at the expense of the people they displaced. And life wasn't always easy for immigrants, like those who chose the United States as their new home. They had to quickly adapt to the new culture and endure rampant xenophobia, the same challenges faced by migrants and refugees across the world today. While we can look back and see the intellectual, economic, and humanitarian contributions of immigrants throughout history, some governments and citizens are reluctant to view today's immigrants in that same light. But our world is even more connected now than it was a century ago, and modern migration can be another opportunity for global growth and connection. If you're enjoying Study Hall Modern World History and are interested in taking online courses and earning college credit, visit gostudyhall.com or click the button to learn more. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.